Welcome, everyone. We will begin tonight with an opening prayer by our host, President Joseph Whitaker, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.
Our dear kind Heavenly Father, we're so very grateful for the many blessings and opportunities that we have in our lives. We're grateful to be able to be gathered here as friends and neighbors to discuss events in our community and the opportunities that we have to make a difference. We pray that Thy Spirit will be here with us, that we may have an enjoyable discussion, that we may all take away something meaningful, something that will allow us to strive to make a difference in our communities. We love Thee, Father. We pray that Thou would bless those that are struggling at this time throughout the world. Help them to feel of Thy love and help us to, again, make a difference as we go throughout our activities during the week. These things we ask and pray and give thanks for, and do so in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen. Thank you. Introducing the others on tonight's panel, next to President Whitaker, Reverend Reinhard Krauss, who we've seen for many years, of course. He is the chairman of the Academy for Jewish, Christian, and Islamic Studies. Next is Rabbi Leah Lewis, Temple Menorah, Father Alexei Smith, the Archdiocese of Los Angeles, and I'm Bob Rothman. We first need to acknowledge the contributions of Drew Tyler, who works behind the scenes back there and has been so good for all of us. He does all of the taping, the live streaming, the editing, the archiving. It's all him. He does it as a volunteer, very gracious. We're very thankful for your work, Drew. I have to divulge, I guess is the word these days, the fact that I am not neutral, as a moderator probably should be. I think our society is heading into deep trouble and gets worse regularly. So don't look for me for balance. I'm not balanced. I'm very fearful of all this. You know. Sometimes I'm balanced, but not on this subject I'm not. But I'm looking forward to hearing from the rest of the panel. Maybe somebody is more optimistic than I am, and I would love to hear it. Recently, I went into a local jewelry store to get a watch adjusted, and now they have 2 doors to be buzzed through. And I said, why do you now have 2 doors? Well, smash and grab has become so prevalent. And if the dollar sum is not really large, they get away with it. There's no police investigation. There's no penalty. And so the criminals feel they have a free rein. And I'm concerned not only for the jewelry store person, the whole smash and grab thing, but what are we telling our children when we say that we're tolerant of crime? If it's not too many dollars, or if the police are too busy or something, then we're going to ignore the crime. What message are we giving? And anybody who would like that one, please, as many of you want to respond, because I'm puzzled. Rabbi, you look ready?
Scratching my nose.
Oh, that'll teach you.
It's a hard comment to respond to, other than I will tell you, I didn't know that you were going to start with that story, but I thought you were going to, when you started by saying you took your watch to be repaired, I thought you were going somewhere else, and I just kept thinking about the joke that I think might have some truth for us right now, and that is that even a broken watch is right twice a day. So, right? So maybe there's a little bit of, sure, there's a lot of garbage that goes on, and too much. And you're right, we ought not tolerate it. But lest we lose hope altogether and give up, there's always, there are things that are redeemable, I think, in society for sure. And I think where you're headed with this conversation is for us to try and identify where those points of hope are, because all is not lost. Twice a day, the broken watch is right.
Well, I would love to hear it, but the momentum is negative, and that's what bothers. And there's so many events that are like that reinforce that. And we, the older people, know how things used to be. I'm afraid the younger ones are taking this to be the norm. And that's as much of my worry as anything. What influence are we having on the people who are growing up when they think this is what happens?
Paul, we are good friends, but on this one I need to push back. I need to push back hard.
Please.
I don't think we're going down the tube. I read an article yesterday that the museums are going through their collection of what artifacts have been looted around the world. So talk about grab and run. This used to be the norm, that the Western powers went during the colonial times to Africa, to Asia, and just looted. Somebody grabbing a watch is a minuscule thing compared to that. So my feeling is we are the generation who are leaving the world in the state that it is. And I have great, great hope when I look at my kids that they have as good a moral compass as I've ever had. So I'm not sure we are living in the same world or on the same planet even.
Well, speak to the average person. Certainly the museums, and those are special people. Let's talk about the great majority of people and how they think and react to this.
Well, I can only speak for myself, and I think each of us needs to speak for ourselves, look at what is truth and what is lies, and each of us. When my kids were little, I used to say to them, God has given you your own head, each of you, so you need to use it. And I think we are not doing that enough in our society. We have a herd mentality, we fall into camps, we follow leaders, sometimes when they are immoral and lying even, and we say, for some greater good. So I think we need to start again to think for ourselves. And that is, to me, a fairly simple recipe for the future of the world. And I find, especially young people, to be full of passion to not let the world go to pot and rob all the resources, but are in favor of sustainability. I was at the panel discussion just last week. Young people are passionate about the future of the planet, that we left them behind. So ethics, yes, we're in a very promising time, I believe.
Are these young people doing smash and grab? Or is that a different bunch of people?
I need to ask them. I haven't asked them. But I think to say all the youth are smash and grab
No, please, I never said that.
No, you never said that. But I also think we need to differentiate. The people I know are not smash and grab. I don't know. And our news is full of news that is sensational, that is enticed to, they call it clickbait now, to say the world is really terrible. It is also a sign of, for me, of getting older, to say the world looks a little darker and it used to be much better in the past. I don't think so. I mean, before the civil rights era, things weren't great. We had I was born a few years after the Second World War, a horrific thing. So anyway, I started my comments by saying we are very good friends, and that's why we can disagree.
Oh, you and I can argue about all kinds of things,
Yes,
and we
exactly.
always have. There's nothing new about that.
Yes, exactly.
And I learn something every time we do that.
I guess I would add, as I think about it, I agree, Bob. I think there are things to be concerned about. As I think about kind of the balance, as I was thinking about this over the last week, this topic, I pulled up a few articles. There was a recent article, relatively recent, within the last 2 or 3 years, from the Wall Street Journal, that did a survey and asked people, how do you feel about our ethics, where we are as a society? And more than 70% of the people felt like that the ethics in the United States were poor. Only 16% believed that we had good ethics. And so I think there are some things, that people are concerned about. And so I think we have to look at the brutal facts on, what's happening. And at the same time, I found some other articles that go back to the 60s and 70s where people were saying the same thing, that they had some of the same concerns. And so, as we think about we've got to look at the brutal facts. At the same time, we have to balance that with the hope that we have in a Heavenly Father, a God that we feel like gives us that hope. And that through that message, that our young, as you talked about, the young people that we have will be able to get passionate about the hope that is there and the things that they can do to make a difference. And we know that it can start with one individual or a group of individuals that move in that direction. So as leaders, as we think about what we can do, not just as religious leaders, but as individuals in our communities, I think one of the things that we have to do is have this balance of high caring and high expectations. We have to have both of those things. We can't just have this high sense of caring or a high sense of expectation by themselves. We have to have those two things together. And I think as we do that, we give our youth an opportunity to really get passionate about the things that they can do to make a difference in our society.
Let me give you a softer kind of issue. When I was young, my father used to take me to college football games. Back then, if the home team made too much noise and the visiting quarterback felt his team could not hear his instructions, his signals, the visiting quarterback would go to the referee and say, I can't be heard. The referee would go to the home coach and tell him, quiet your crowd or you will be penalized. Now, the exact opposite happens. There's no sense of sportsmanship. The sense is, if I can drown out the visiting people, that's good, and we're going to do it, and we're going to make all this noise as loud as we can so they can't do their thing. That's not nice. But that is the norm of sports now, particularly football. They talk about the 12th man who makes all the noise to confuse the other team. And sportsmanship used to mean setting the stage so the other team could do their best, and your best would hopefully be better than theirs. Everybody in the stands is trying to interfere with the visiting team. Now, a lot of people in the stands, I don't mean to say everybody. Another example where we're not respectful of other people, and this is something that's done by thousands all the time at each stadium. You have a soft point there, Reinhard?
I'm not
Father
following
Alexei?
sports, I think. And I have my other questions about football, that it's a very dangerous sport, but that's a different issue. But I agree with you that we have become more partisan in this society, more factional, which is why I think we need interreligious conversations more than ever, especially within each religious tradition. we have become very factional. I went to a talk this past Sunday about the crisis of democracy in Israel by the president in Israel of J Street. And a similar thing is happening within the Christian community between evangelicals and mainstream Christians. So it is not just inter-religious dialogue, we have also become less civil and respectful of each other. My feeling is we can only move to that respect if we actually get to know one another on a personal basis, forming relationships, forming friendships, and not assuming we know who the other person is, who the other religious tradition is. I've said it before, Krista Stendahl, the Swedish New Testament scholar, once said, if you want to find out about another religion, you should ask the people who love and practice it, not its enemies. And sometimes we feel too comfortable in our own bubble, whether it's political, whether it's ethical, whether it's religious. And we need to move beyond our comfort zone and ask each other, saying, who are you? Why do you believe what you believe? And I believe in many cases we will find out people are not so crazy as we assume when we are in our own tribe or when we listen to particular news channels. I'm not naming names.
Back to sports for just a moment. Have you ever gone to what many people call football or soccer games at the new stadium downtown?
I've heard about it, yeah.
Oh, well, you won't hear anything but constant cheering, and that's part of the ethos of the whole game.
Yeah.
Okay? But I think that all of my colleagues here have hit on the core issue, which is that I think we have to, and first of all, I think there's hope. Somewhere in the Psalms it says hope springs eternal. There's certainly hope. I don't see everything as dark. There are segments of society that certainly need cultivation. And what they need to be cultivated, what we all need to be cultivated in, is to develop, once again, the respect for human life, a basic human life. And if we had that type of respect, then we would perhaps let our conscience be developed, and we would be less apt to come and steal everything, you know, that just because we want it and it belongs to someone else. And civility, absolutely. We have to develop a civil way of speaking with one another, especially with those with whom we disagree. And we have to learn to listen. We have to learn to listen to what the other person is actually saying, not what we might think we hear them saying, but what they are actually saying. I'll never forget, this was decades ago, when Pope Paul VI and Athenagoras, the Greek Orthodox Patriarch, met together for the first time. Leaders of these churches met in decades, and they described it as an opportunity to look each other in the eye. And that's what we have to do with people. We have to become that intimate with others and open ourselves to being vulnerable with others, to actually listen to them and hear them and talk with them and make room for them and us as they make room for us and them.
And the only way we can do that is to understand that the other person sitting in the other camp is a human being.
That's right.
Right? That's the only reason we would care enough. And so we're all created in
fellow
God's
human being.
image,
Yes.
right? We're all created in God's image, and everybody, therefore, by definition, has something to offer and something worth listening to. We have a similar model in Judaism of the two great sages of the early rabbinic period. There was Hillel and Shammai, and they were known for disagreeing about pretty much everything, and they're held in, and all of their arguments are recorded in the rabbinic writings, but they're held in this high regard because their disagreements, there's a category of disagreement that is recorded. It says that they disagreed l'shem shamayim, for the sake of heaven. And what makes a disagreement for the sake of heaven? It's exactly what you said. They listened to each other. They learned from each other, even though they disagreed. And even though, the law went with usually Hillel, not Shammai, it doesn't matter, right? They learn from each other. And so we're supposed to model ourselves after that. But in order to do that, we have to realize that the person we don't agree with or don't know so much about, or looks different from us, or talks different from us, or believes different from us, or votes different from us, is still created in God's image, and therefore worthwhile.
And
Go ahead.
if I might just continue with that thought, Rabbi, about being created in God's image, in Eastern Christianity, we would say, yes, being created in God's image is a great gift to us, but it's also an occupation, because we are called then to grow into his likeness. Mm-hmm. And how do we grow into his likeness? By modeling the life that he has set for us to live.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. I was thinking about that, Bob, when I was thinking about some of the questions you had posed and thinking about this conversation. Again, it's the same idea, only, I was in Jewish context, in the Torah scroll that is our sacred text, there's meaning to everything. And we just passed in our weekly Torah reading cycle, because we go through the whole thing over the course of a year, we just passed the middle 2 weeks ago. We just, so we're 2 weeks past the middle of the year in this Torah reading cycle. And I was thinking about it this week, that directly, exactly, precisely in the middle of the Torah is that exact lesson, that we're all that it's the command to be, you shall be holy. And implied in that is that we're not there yet. Yes. You shall be. Yes, exactly. This is our job. This is our occupation. It's exactly what you just said. And it is not by accident in our tradition that it is directly at the center, at the heart of the Torah, is the command to act more like God. Right, because why shall you be holy? Because the Torah says, because I, God, am holy. Right, so that's the rationale. So we should be more like God.
I just learned something wonderful, that's in the middle of the Torah.
Directly in the middle.
Holy envy. This is another concept that Krista Stendow had. Mm-hmm. Even though we are not the same, and we need to also explore our differences, we can at times develop holy envy. To say, this is something very beautiful in your tradition. This is what just happened to me. I had a little tinge of holy envy.
Holy envy. I love that.
Yeah.
Reinhard, you should sit in Shabbat service in a synagogue. The rabbis will always find good words in the Torah in every chapter.
Well, it says the
It's
Torah
there.
has 70 faces because it's there in the Torah. It's a rich treasure, right?
Holy envy. That's great.
One thing I think we would agree on is extraordinarily depressing are the murders that have become part of everyday newspaper news, mass murders. Guns are not much more plentiful than they were 40, 50 years, but these mass murders suddenly are every day. It's terrible to read about it and hear what is in the minds of people who do that, and who is doing it, and how does it work? And does anybody want to speak to that, or should we just say all agree that it's terrible and move on?
Well, again, the basic premise there is that people who enact those horrendous crimes, of these mass shootings and such, have no respect for anyone else's life.
That's right.
So it gets back to that again. Developing a respect for each and every individual as a unique creation of God, made in his image.
And how do we as people move that along? How can we help that?
Well, I think we certainly as religious leaders have to model that by the way we interact with people, how we respect everyone, how we accept everyone. We may not agree with everyone, but we have to listen to them civilly. We have to listen to them respectfully. And as I said earlier, we have to really hear what they're telling us.
We are in an era of single interest voters who
That's right.
have one cause and that's all they care about.
That's right.
And they don't want to hear any, don't want to discuss, and everything is focused on their one cause. How do you get through to people like that and tell them there are intelligent people who have different opinions than you, and they deserve the courtesy and respect that comes, as Rabbi Lewis said earlier, from being a fellow human being? How do you get that across?
I think one approach might be to be aware that people, even if they're single issue voters, to perhaps not focus on discussing this single issue endlessly, because there is at times a hopeless circular argument when you debate. But when you talk about other issues in their lives, about their children, their hopes for their children, their job, and you create friendship in terms of being really interested in who are you really, I think we can at times break through that. And I would also not say, we need to be careful of saying we are the righteous ones and these are the bad people. So what is in the mind of people who go on these shooting rampages? I do not know, but my hunch is that people are in a deep, deep spiral of despair and fear and don't see their own life as being worthwhile. And they end it and want to take a whole number of people with them because everything looks bleak and meaningless. I'm not sure whether somebody reaching out in genuine interest to somebody like this could not at times make a difference. I mean, I'm not saying in this case miracles can happen, but given our shared deep belief that everybody is a human being created in the image of God, sometimes that image is so buried that it is our job as religious people, as people of faith, to try and see with the eyes of God where that image may be buried in another person, where it may be very disfigured. And let us be honest, other people don't immediately see the image of God in us all the time when we are driving in traffic and cursing other people out, right? So, yeah.
Well, I think as you, again, it's easy to look at the extremes and say, how on earth can we have an impact in those extremes? And I think as we look at adding value, we have to start where we are, with what we can do. And I think certainly, we may not be able to save all of these individuals, but the question is, what can we do in the communities that we're in? How can we do some of the things that have been talked about? How do we to reach out and try to understand people that are within our communities? And again, ultimately, I think our young people, our youth, are those folks that we should be engaging in this process and helping them understand that if they're uncomfortable, dissatisfied with their circumstances, where they are, they can change that by making different choices. Oftentimes young people feel like that they're trapped, that there's no way out. How do we help them understand that by changing their choices, they can change their life, right? And sometimes it's hard for them to see that. So again, I think the opportunity is to focus initially on the communities that we're in and that we serve, and ultimately, as many of those young people go out into other parts of the world, then they can have a greater impact. And so I think it's those small steps, those small correct choices that we can make on a daily basis, on a weekly basis, that will move us in that direction. We're probably not going to have a huge impact on the murder percentage in LA in the short run, but over time, as we focus on on changing the lives and impacting and engaging our young people to do good and to understand why that's important and how they can contribute in society and why they would even want to do that, why that would even be important to them, then obviously that influence over time can grow. But I think it's the small things that we can do now that will have the biggest impact.
And I would actually add that I think we're obligated to.
Absolutely.
We're obligated to do it. We have to model it for the young people who, by the way, all the research shows that the generation of people in their teens and 20s right now, they are more motivated to participate in things that cause a difference in the world and are filled with meaning than the generations that are older than them. So we have to model for them that even one conversation, looking one person in the eye instead of walking right by them on the street and pretending they're not human beings, when we model these things, that is changing the world. I was thinking about, there's a teaching from a rabbi from the 18th, 19th century by the name of Israel Salanter, who was very depressed for most of his life. And then as he got older, he kind of felt a little bit more comfortable, and his disciples said to him, so what did you learn? What have you learned? And he said, he was the leader of a great movement within Judaism in Europe, and he said, when I was young, I set out to change the world, and I couldn't change the world. So I got a little bit older, and then I think he was in Lithuania, I could be wrong, I'd have to look it up. So then I tried to change my country. Let's say Lithuania, I could be wrong. And I couldn't change Lithuania. So I waited, and then I realized I just needed to change my town. And I couldn't change my town, so I tried to change my family, and you know where we're going. And then I decided to change myself and make myself do something. And that's when I was able to change the world. And so, lest we get too overwhelmed, Bob, I think we are obligated as people of faith and as people who recognize that there's a generation after us to do something, anything, and you never know the ripple effects of that.
Well, let me ask, go ahead.
I think the greatest evidence of what you just talked about initially there, Rabbi, was the young people's involvement in ecological issues today.
100%.
That they want to change
you
that.
mentioned that too, right?
Yeah, exactly right.
You four are all community leaders. One of the things that I see regularly is that the younger have less respect for authority than earlier generations. You see it written, how true it is, and of course, as we've said earlier, there are some on this side and some on that side. But do you see respect for authority being an issue that you need to deal with in your world?
I think that depends on how you define authority. I mean, if the days when the priest said you did this and everybody did that are long since gone. I don't know about rabbis, but
Definitely.
Yeah.
I don't have any bumper stickers on my car. But I have long thought that if I ever put a bumper sticker on my car, it would be question authority. And maybe because I'm German, I'm allergic to authority, and especially blind authority. So I think it is, on the whole, a good development that we are free to question authority. Questioning authority is not the same as disrespect. Those two are very different. Disrespect and the way what I'm hearing in schools, what teachers are dealing with, that is disrespect, that is not questioning authority. But in my role as a teacher, I welcome critical questions that my authority is questioned, that I tell my students, I'm not here to tell you what to think, but to give you something to think about. And to me, questioning authority is part of becoming responsible citizens, and I don't think we do it enough. questioning authority, we still don't do it enough. But I'm absolutely adamantly opposed to an attitude of disrespect, personal destruction, and if that's what you mean by not respecting authority, we are in the same boat, Bob.
I guess I would, as I think about your question, I think, and I certainly agree that I'm not, personally, I've grown up in a world where it's okay to question things. Again, I think you can ask questions without being disrespectful. And I think hopefully we're teaching our youth and helping them see, modeling that, process. I think one of the things that we can't just expect our youth or anyone just to trust us, right? That is blind trust. I think we have to be, if you think about just general human needs, people want to love, they want to be loved, they want to feel important, they want to feel like they're valued, that they're significant. They want to have some level of variety in their lives. And so I think part of, getting to a place where we can understand each other is building strong relationships built on trust. And so I think part of that is some of the things that we've been talking about already. We have to be willing to listen to where they are. We think about the mental health issues that we have in our country, and they're huge. I mean, much of that, though, is because people, and I'm not talking about, obviously, if someone has a chemical imbalance and there's something from a medical perspective that needs to be, but much of some of the more general mental health issue comes from people's feeling of not being understood. Mm-hmm. And so I think as leaders, and especially as community leaders and religious leaders, we have an obligation, we have a responsibility to make sure that those young people feel heard, that we're trying to understand where they are. And I think that's the beginning of a conversation. And I think, at least my experience has been, especially with our youth, is as we have those conversations, they're extremely respectful. If they, again, people want to feel like that they're valued, that we see value and significance. And of course, we've already discussed that they are valued, that they do have value. And literally, we believe that they're sons, and daughters of God. That's one of our beliefs. And so, as we think about that, they have incredible value. But we have to help them see that and build that trust so that we can have meaningful conversations. Until we've done that, we're not going to be able to have those meaningful conversations because they're not going to feel heard, they're not going to feel that value, they're not going to feel loved. And again, those are all basic human needs.
I once attended a lecture by a Nobel laureate physicist, and he was asked about his childhood and his relationship in his family. And he said when he would come home from school every day, his mother would say, not what did you learn today, what questions did you ask? And I've always remembered that's a very important concept to learn, is to ask other people to help you understand things. Let me ask something that needs to be asked here. Who do you use for a positive role model? Who in the national press, in the sports and entertainment and political world, in the public that is written about and covered incessantly in the media, who do you respect? Who do you say to people, young teenagers who ask, show me a model? Who do you use? How do you answer that question? Anybody? Go ahead.
This is a non-answer, so I'll just start with a non-answer, with the fact that it's a non-answer. We can look at the images that we see, which are everywhere. That's part of the issue. We see everything now. And we can point to people who seem to have great, whatever's put in front of us is a positive example. And if we fall into the trap of thinking that we're seeing their everything about them, and that we should follow what somebody's lead, then I think we're not doing justice to whoever we're trying to show what true good moral exemplarship, if that's a word, would be, because we really only know what we see. And so we have to be looking at the people that we know, people in our families and in our communities and community leaders who we know and trust beyond a 10-second soundbite or however many character, 170 characters on Twitter, whatever it is, people that we can see beyond the surface. And so I think it comes back to the humanity and real relationship, and trying to also help people see that the images that are thrown in front of us are not the full story.
Well, I knew that we were going to be talking about this for a little while, and so this evening at dinner, as I've been thinking about this, we have just one daughter left at home and my wife, and so I asked them this question. So who are the role models that you see out? And I didn't really give them any context, and my soon-to-be 16-year-old sophomore in high school immediately said, Mom and Dad first. All right, so getting some brownie points there at the table, right? That's never bad. And then right to teachers. Right to teachers, and then she went, based to the prophet of our church. He was a heart surgeon, very successful individual. The values that she's been exposed to. So I think it's right down those lines. I mean, it's hard to look at because there's so much noise out there with movie stars and athletes and these people that are in the media. But she knows, she has a better sense for some of the people that she mentioned. And I think our expectations, as we've talked about earlier, is that we, as parents, as leaders, it's a lot to put on our teachers. I mean, I understand that, but I think many of the teachers, they're there for a reason. They want to be there. It's typically not there because of the pay, right? We all know that. It's because they love doing that. So I think it is the folks in their community that we can look to create those role models.
I would also add to that I think part of role modeling is role modeling real life.
Right.
Because the images that are out there of supermodels or whatever it is, popular culture, these are snapshots that I think, especially for teens, and I spend a lot of time with teens, including the ones in my home, they're unrealistic standards, and they're only getting a snapshot anyway, and that I think feeds into the mental health issues and the challenges of belonging and am I good enough and self-worth. And so again, real human beings that are living up to our community standards are much more realistic and healthy.
And to go back to what we said, that each of us is created in God's image. If that is true, then I think deep down we also know what right living is, what the right values are. It may be buried, and it is buried to some extent. And as you said, we need to grow into that image. It needs to be polished. But at the same time, I think we resonate with people who we see living authentically of what it means to be human. Recently, I asked the question, and it was with students, to say, what is your earliest religious memory? And who taught you? And it was very interesting, and we can ask ourselves, each of ourselves, that question. Was it perhaps a grandfather, a grandmother? Was it perhaps a teacher who we knew was somebody who was authentic? And I think we all have, I hope, we all have people like that in our lives. And it's not because they have external authority, but it rings true. They're fully human, or they exhibit something of that image of God, whether you call it deep ethic, honesty, truth. They also tell us when we have been naughty, and that it doesn't mean they're just always nice to us. But I think, and I hope, we all have had and have people in our lives who are models, and I'm not sure it's so much in the public sphere as you say. In the public sphere, politicians, sports people, stars, those are fake images. They're not the real people behind it. And the other thing I want to say is, in a society where there is a lot of violence, I think a lot of people are also very afraid. Just a little example. I sold something on Craigslist this past weekend, and somebody stopped by. And they seemed to be really nervous. And they said, "Oh my God, our car broke down." And I said, "Oh, let me go and see whether I have a jumper cable." The battery was dead. And they said, "Really? Wow." And you could see that they warmed up, or their anxiety eased. And I said, "Oh, unfortunately I don't, but could I make you a cup of coffee while you wait for the..." And they said, wow, this is, oh, you're so nice. I said, "So how much effort is it to make a cup of coffee in a situation like this?" It's none. But I saw the fear, or the concern, I wouldn't say fear, melt, of saying, I'm going in a strange neighborhood, I'm buying somebody from something, and who is this? And it was just a little gesture, and to see the people, to alleviate their concern a little, did me really good. And so I think it's little moments like this where we need to take the opportunity to say, "Oh, you're a real person. You're not just a customer. You're not just handing me cash and I give you whatever I have." And so how often do we take the opportunity? And I would say, how often have I missed that opportunity?
Small
Gestures like that create great ripples.
Absolutely.
Great ripples.
Let me give you an example of something I grew up with. I grew up in Georgia, and I heard often from teachers, adults, ministers, the story about Bobby Jones. Bobby Jones was another Georgia boy. He was the best golfer in the world back in the 1920s. Amateur, won the pro stuff, top golfer. Bobby Jones was in a tournament one time and he hit a ball into the trees, and he went in after the ball. And nobody can see him, he's hidden, he's behind stuff, and ball comes out onto the fairway, and the scorekeeper says, 1 stroke. And Bobby Jones said, 2. I swung at it and missed. And the example was made that character and integrity is what you do when nobody is watching. And I don't see examples like that today. That always had a big effect on me. And I just don't see anything close to that anymore.
But they're happening.
They're happening.
They're happening.
Absolutely.
Yeah, but the point is you don't see them, right?
Right.
People do it in the bushes.
Well,
This
Bobby
kind of-
Jones was not about to let a lie go by.
Yeah, but you see also any number of examples of people acting correctly. I mean, in one of these recent mass shootings, and at a school, I think, and the parents obviously ran to the school to try to get to their children, and they weren't allowed in, but the neighbors around the school opened the doors and welcomed them and said, stay here with us until we can find out things. I agree with you. A lot of these incidents they never make the headlines, and they should. And I think it's for us to press the people in charge of all the news and everything to try to be more I don't know, real.
Yeah.
Not just report the negative, but the positive as well, to balance that.
Absolutely.
But who has the responsibility of teaching ethics to children? I think we all agree it has to start in the family.
Absolutely.
And I think we would agree, secondly, that religious leadership is very important, even though religious participation is declining, so that there's less opportunity to do that. And we would also shake our heads that I think that people think that the schools should be doing this when this is not a function of the schools and is not properly done in the schools. But where now? How do we encourage children to learn ethics when the most important place is their own home?
Well,
Go ahead.
I would just make a slight correction to what you said there about schools, because certain schools, certainly we would be teaching ethics. I would imagine Jewish schools, certainly in Catholic schools, we would be teaching ethics.
All right, this is not the majority of students.
Yeah.
Well, and also, I think it depends on how you define ethics.
Ethics.
I mean, civility is taught. I have my son who's taking government at a public school in Torrance, he's learning a version of it. Of course, I think it's filled out when he comes home and we're having bigger conversations that are more nuanced, that fit our family's values, that it's not the school's place to offer. But, there is a foundation of basic civility, and then the particularism that goes with each religious, with each faith, that belongs in place, that belongs in the home. But I think it's one thing to teach it by speaking it. Really, the only real way to teach it is to model it. And that can only happen, again, when you're really in relationship with somebody. So to stand up in front of even a wonderful teacher who lives a wonderful life, if a child is with them only an hour a day, and they give a great lecture about it, it's just another subject. It's living it and modeling it that makes a difference.
So the students who do not have the advantages that your children do of living in your home where this is brought up and you regard it as being absolutely, totally important for you as a parent, how do you reach the children who don't have that advantage?
First of all, I would just say, you could talk to my children. I don't know, they would say the same thing.
I was going to say that, actually.
How do I say this? But I think it's about community involvement, right? I mean, when we live in isolation, it's harder. When we live in community, it's easier.
Yeah, I think it goes back to the old saying, it takes a village, right? And whether it's the village of your family, you're an uncle, you're an aunt, your grandfather, you're a brother, a sister, but in the community, right? We have responsibilities within our communities to have an impact with our neighbors, and so I do think it is the modeling that is most important. I mean, what we say is oftentimes heard, but what we do is believed, right? And that's really what we want. We want that belief. And so for that to happen, it has to be people that they associate with on a regular basis. It can't be, as much as we would hope that our teachers, and we believe that our teachers are providing good examples, because they're not staying with one teacher all day, they don't have that impact. So it's the people in their daily lives, and as parents, it's understanding who are their friends and what impact are they having. So again, it's a part. It's a process of building relationships in the community, in your families. That certainly can happen in churches, but to your point, as church attendance may decline, we still have responsibility within our communities to help and do those things.
I also want to say, so what about the question when on the ballot there is an apportionment for schools? Do you automatically vote in favor of paying more taxes for schools to fund schools? Or do you say, no, I'd rather spend my money in a different way. I'm not investing in teachers. That gives the students and the children the resources, both in the hard sciences and subjects, but also in art and music. So that is a question that addresses us as the older generation to say, am I selfish or am I being generous? So that is beyond the question of the personal interaction with youth. It addresses a question of systemic issues. The other point I would like to make that I think we haven't made in this discussion, religion is not always a good influence on ethics. Religious wars at the very extremes have been fought. And sometimes in our religious congregations, we don't teach the fact that we ought to know the other person, the other person of a different faith or of no faith, and that they're equally valuable than us. Sometimes our religious life is the most partisan and doesn't teach openness and kindness and generosity, and foments actually partisanship. So we also need to look inward to say, as religious people, are we really practicing what our faith actually teaches, or do we, with our doctrines, sow division? Or do we actually, I mean, I'm a Christian, do I follow Jesus who says you ought to love people? And they say, well, like who? And he said, the person in front of you. And they said, well, but if I don't like him, he said, yeah, even the enemy. So no exceptions. No exceptions. You ought to love people as yourself. Even if they're Muslim, yes. Even if they're Jews, yes. Even if they're atheists, absolutely yes. And so do we practice that? Do we sometimes live up to our deepest values and beliefs that we profess in our actions? And as has been said on this panel, actions speak louder than words. We can talk a lot, but what we do, my parents, for example, came from a very, very conservative, I would say fundamentalist Christian background, but they always invited people over for dinner who were at the edge of the congregation, not the power brokers. And that spoke volumes to me.
We have a problem now in universities which should be fervent believers in free speech and fervent teachers, that there are students who try to drown out a speaker that they don't want to hear. They disagree with the person's message, and so they won't let him or her speak. And you see this frequently in the media, that this is happening, and this is very bothersome. I mean, everybody's going to say, yeah, it is, but I think that's just another example of what I said in the beginning, that I think things are getting worse.
I want to push back on that a little too, even.
I knew you would, Reinhard.
I am somewhat familiar with UCLA because I have some connections there. And the problem is not so much that in general there is not free speech and people can express their views, and students express their views in all kinds of ways. When you walk across campus, you get all kinds of leaflets of every stripe. But the problem, according to the student administration, is that some outside groups bring in very contentious, incendiary speakers that foment division and create dissension and trouble on campus. So it's not so much what's happening on campus, but the interference by outside groups, by lobbying groups who try to make trouble. And of course, that gets the attention of the media and the press. My own observation is that debate and reflection and discussion on campus among students is alive and well. But the outside agitators that at times are brought in are really troublesome. And I would agree with you that they rile people up to such an extent that sometimes they are not allowed to speak, and that's in a country that is founded on free speech very troublesome. I agree.
Agree.
Yes,
All right.
most of the time.
Reinhard, I'll buy you a drink. Not here, of course, but
Let's have a cookie.
let me explore a problem that I think is adding. I think that truth is becoming indistinguishable from fiction. It's just losing its status as any absolute. In a recent Pew poll, 80% of the people polled saw the news as the big problem. Propagandists have always relied on the fact that if you repeat the lie often enough, it becomes truth. And the question is this happening more? Has this concept moved down so it happens to more people, more events, more things? Are we reaching the point where the border is being blurred between truth and fiction? How do you know who to believe when you see a lot of information coming at you? Some, and they're quite opposed. And some of it say one thing, some of it say the other. And so what tends to happen, I think, is that people listen to the ones that they want to listen to and listen to the things that they want to hear, which again accentuates the polarity that goes on. But what can we do about news media who are more concerned about their advertising revenue than the principles of journalism? And there are many. Bob's being nasty again, huh?
No, I think things are getting. I'm happy to live in a world where I have access to multiple news channels. I'm reading on a regular basis the BBC, The Guardian, the New York Times. I also read Russian news channels. And it provides input, and after all, I'm gifted by God, I think, with reason and insight, and to sift through and who makes good arguments. I think what is terrible that despite the wealth of information that we have, different news sources, oftentimes we stay in our own echo chamber and don't get multiple sources and sift through and make up our own minds. And I think more than ever, we need to read all news and all information critically and make up our own minds. I don't think it's hopeless. In fact, 20 years ago, I felt much less informed and less clearer about a view of the world than I am now. And it is not automatic that I'm in the Western camp where everybody thinks you need to. The news and the world situation and politics is much more nuanced, and it always was nuanced than if you have one or two papers that you read. So I'm grateful that I have a wealth of information sources and I can make up my own mind. And I'm happy to discuss when somebody agrees with me. And I mean, I had a student in class who said, as everybody knows, and then he let out some some statement. And I said, oh, does everybody know in the class? Raise your hands. And of course, no, not everybody knew. And I said, so tell me, how did you arrive at your views? And I think that's why when we talk with each other, instead of simply throwing slogans at each other, to say, how did you arrive at your conclusions? What are you reading? What are your information sources? And I think that's the only way for us to become and be an informed citizenry, rather than we only listen to CNBC or Fox News or whatever our favorite flavor is.
And I would say that that is 100% true, and the fact that you keep coming back to this notion that you have this God-given gift to be able to think freely, it is challenging, and it only gets more challenging because there are these algorithms that show us what we ought to be seeing. So the other piece of it is that we're at a place where it is very easy to sit back and wait for the news or the headlines to come to us. And of course, they're selected for us by these algorithms that tell us try to give us more of what they think we want. So it takes being proactive and having a little bit of patience and taking the time to read multiple papers and go out and find things. But we have the ability to go back to what you said. There's a big difference, and this is where I think maybe the challenge that you're raising, Bob, between knowledge and discernment.
Truth in fiction. Truth is what I'm questioning.
Right, but I think it's discernment, right? That we can use our minds to be able to figure out the difference, perhaps, between truth and fiction.
We don't know what's happening in Ukraine. We're dependent upon reports to tell us that, and reports can be in different directions.
True, but I'm sorry.
I once, in an idealistic fit, subscribed for a year to both the National Review and the New Republic, figuring if I read both, I could get a feel from what Reinhard just said. It didn't work. It's a different world. There is no middle ground between those. You can't look at this side and that side and then decide what's in the middle. You can't do it. At least I couldn't.
Yeah.
Maybe you can. I couldn't do it. I think that the bias, you recognize, we all recognize certain networks are biased this way and other networks are biased this way, and certain newspapers are biased, and then because the New York Times, it cares about their revenue and their subscriptions. They don't care what the person in Montana thinks about their writing. They're a profitable unit, and they're dependent upon revenue, and this affects a good deal in what they decide to cover and how they decide to cover it. And this leaves the rest of us at their mercy because we don't have any way of verifying anything that they tell us.
So are you saying you're against capitalism, Paul? Is that what you're saying?
I'm saying I believe,
Exactly, out of the way.
I do believe in the responsibility of the media, which I think is a vanishing concept.
Which is why I think the BBC is an interesting model, and PBS.
Yes.
Oh, I subscribe to The Economist.
Publicly financed media that seek to provide a balanced view. Yeah.
I subscribe to The Economist, The Washington Post, and The Wall Street Journal. So, I mean, I see it from different angles, and you wonder, what's real? How do you know? You have to pick somebody that you trust, or pick something you trust, and say, I'm taking this to be the truth because I believe this source.
I don't have that need to feel like I need to believe and trust. I feel comfortable with being exposed to different perspectives and news and making up my own mind. and seeing the world to the best of my ability. I don't feel I need certainty.
Well, there's a difference between different facts and different opinions, and I think it gets blurred.
Okay.
But how has that changed over
What's
time?
different? Yeah.
I mean, we have more information now. Think about, you talked
Right.
about being born right after World War II. What did the world know that? There's so much more information out there to be consumed now than there has at any point in human history. So
Yeah.
it's a matter of what we do with how the information is presented, how the information is digested, and how we come back to our God-given reasoning skills to make sense out of them.
It's hard to reason on things that you are dependent upon all of your input from somewhere else. It's not something that you see yourself or that you have any direct knowledge of, but you're dependent upon what is given to you, and that's where the rub comes in.
But this is nothing new.
Well,
You won't be, I'm sorry.
no, you go ahead.
I don't expect you to be familiar with this, but in the Gospels, when Jesus appears before Pilate, Pilate asks him, Jesus says something about truth, and Pilate says, truth? What is truth? So people have been asking this question for centuries.
Yep, I agree.
Scored one. I'm sorry, you were going to say something.
No, I think that's an excellent point. The only thing I was going to say is, as you talk about the polarization, certainly the information and a lot of these algorithms, the more we click on one type of topic, the more of that topic we get. It creates a lot of the polarization. So the technology is a wonderful thing. We do have to intentionally, specifically look for different views. But I would say, even though we may not know the level of credibility on everything that we see, the difference today is versus 20 years ago is we may have gotten no information at all. So we were just completely in the dark. And so, it's still a challenge to figure out, what is the facts, but at least we have more to look at if we intentionally go out there and look for those things. It doesn't, I certainly agree with you. It becomes challenging to understand who is giving us their perspective and who is giving fact, because oftentimes people give their perspective as fact, and it's not fact. But at the same time, through technology, we have the opportunity to see more, to be exposed to different things, whereas 20, 30 years ago, we just had no idea that these things were going on because we weren't exposed to them because we didn't have the technology to do that.
Yeah, and it goes back to your earlier question about authority. And as I said, maybe because I'm German and was raised in post-war Germany, I'm practically allergic to authority. And I don't take anything on authority, but is it convincing? Is it plausible? Does it make sense? And this is the way I function with the news, with other people, to say, yes, it's possible to be fooled and conned, but I have my own reasoning and responsibility, and I feel comfortable of not knowing in every case that I'm absolutely convinced of the truth of what somebody else was telling me. In my former life, when I was a pastor, I had many people come to me, tell me amazing stories of the dire straits they were in, and you are probably having similar stories. And in some cases, they were entirely fictional. And the people who are really in need, were too squeamish and humble and afraid to speak up and say, I need something. So I had my critical antennas up when somebody was telling me a story and say, can I verify this? Can I call somebody that you are telling me? And somebody gave me a number of a former pastor. I say, okay, what's the number? I call, oh yeah, they must be out of town. They are not picking up. And so I think all of us who are religious leaders have had those experiences. But to me, that's part of living, that you can't always be sure that what somebody else is telling you, especially if it's on TV, that you take it at face value.
Questions? Let me come around. We don't have a microphone, but I'll walk out here anyway and see who wants to ask a question. Who has a question? Oh, come on, I just walked down here so somebody could ask a question. Go ahead. Very loud because there's no mic.
We talk about fact checking. Wouldn't it be great if this new EA device that they're coming out will do the fact checking for us, because they're totally unbiased. And I don't think kids read what we're talking about. They don't read the papers and all that stuff. I think that's us, the older people read it. The young people have their own world.
That's true. It's unquestionably true. And artificial intelligence is being questioned as to whether it's a positive, where the negatives are and where the positives are for it. Yes, ma'am.
I'm interested in comments about the effect that social media is having on our ethics.
Social media and its effect on our ethics.
In some sense, a bit of an oxymoron, social media. Because the more you send snippets, whether it's texts or the less social it becomes. The most social is when you sit face to face with somebody and look them in the eye and you have a conversation, you can read body language. So I would say social media for of factual, say, when can we meet, is fine, but when it substitutes relationships, it's very detrimental, in my view.
I guess I would just expand. I absolutely agree with that. I would expand that and say that it's almost intentionally not real. And because it's not real, but the people that are viewing it are seeing it as absolutely real, right? It creates this very misleading facade of, you have this incredible life, that you do these things all the time, and I don't do any of those things. So I think as we think about the mental health issue with a lot of our young people, the data is clear that it is creating a lot of those mental health issues, because there's this, oh my gosh, you know, all these people that I know are having these incredible lives. I don't do any of those things. But most of those things are not reality, so it is problematic. So it's, from a technology perspective, it's always nice, and there's always benefit to technology, but there's always cons to every technology. And I think that's an absolute con, is that it's giving our young people this misleading perspective around other people's lives.
The algorithms we were talking about, I think, takes people out of the agency over the information for all of us. You have to go so much further out of your way. And at the same time, I feel like somebody here needs to come to the defense. It's not all bad. Yes, no. Exactly. Right? It gives people voice. So if I am out questioning authority and doing it in a respectful way, and I have an issue that I feel strongly about, or I see some injustice going on in the world, I have a voice to let it be heard. So I don't think it's necessary. It's not all bad, and it's filled with danger. I think it just puts life on steroids. It's more of everything.
Well put, life on steroids.
One of the things that I have learned in dealing so closely with so many different clergy is that people become clergy because they have something they want to say.
I was on a panel earlier today. I was the only clergy. I had to be very careful.
Two in one day. Good for you. One more question? Anybody? Yes. Go ahead.
Panel, thank you for volunteering your time and for being here this evening. Your constituents that come to you and want to talk to you about various subjects, are those subjects different today than they were 5 and 10 years ago?
Are those subjects different? They might be more intense in one way or another, but they're the same general areas, same general concerns. Because life can be more complicated for many people today, or they're making their lives more complicated than they need make them. But it's the same issue. So, I don't make enough money to raise my kids. My wife and I are having difficulties. My parents don't understand me. Same questions, but sometimes much more intensely.
I would respond to that, and I definitely, absolutely, a lot of the same issues. I think, and I've been in some type of leadership responsibility in our church for just over 21 years. And as I look back, a lot of the issues are very similar, but what we're seeing today is a lot more mental health issues. More than certainly double or triple what we were seeing 10, 15 years ago in the church, and especially with the youth. So that, it's not that didn't exist, and I'm not sure if it's just more visible or if it's gotten worse. It seems to me that it's gotten worse, but certainly they're more comfortable talking about it today than they were before. So that's an area that seems like it really has escalated in the last 3 to 5 years from our perspective.
Which, again, for better or worse, I think somehow, to put the two questions together, I think has some connection to social media. It has become so acceptable to talk about it, better and worse, mostly better, because there's space for people. It's not stigmatized like it was.
Well, thank you all for coming. It's been a good year. Next year we won't have to worry about the after effects of COVID, so more people will be here. Bring your friends, and we'll see you in next fall. Thank you.